Let me very quickly introduce the panelists who all seem to have been sat rather far away from me. I'm not sure why. But anyway, I hope we'll have a warm and close discussion. Nearest to me is Gosta Ljungman, who is the resident representative in Ukraine of the IMF. Next to him is Katarina Mathernova, who is Deputy Director General for European Neighbourhood Policy and Enlargement Negotiations at the European Commission. Then we have Francis Malige, who is the Managing Director for Eastern Europe and the Caucasus at the EBRD. And at the end, Jason Pellmar, who is Regional Manager for Ukraine, Belarus and Moldova at the International Finance Corporation. So we have, I hope, about half an hour. I'm going to try and keep it fairly quick and free-flowing if we can. Let me ask Gosta Ljungman from the IMF, first of all, if you could give us your assessment of the current status of the IMF program, and what are the chances of getting it back on track and getting the next tranche paid out, particularly with regard to the anti-corruption court, which we've heard so much about this morning.
Okay. So following the revolution in 2014, the fund came in quickly, and we agreed on a program in April 2014. That program was then replaced in 2015 with the four-year program that we currently have with Ukraine. That program is going to expire next year in March 2019. Under this program, this was the current one, that was a 17.5 billion program. We have so far dispersed about $8.5 billion. We are now working on the fourth review, and some key issues that we have to resolve in order to complete this review is the adoption of legislation establishing an anti-corruption court. It's also ensuring that our previous agreements on adjusting domestic gas tariffs in line with import prices is being followed, and is also ensuring that overall that macroeconomic policy holds together and is supportive of macroeconomic stability and long-term growth. All of these issues they're feasible, and they can be resolved with the right will reasonably quickly. And once they are, then we can take this review to our executive board and complete it and approve the disbursement of the next tranche under the program, which is going to be about $1.9 billion.
The President Poroshenko said at a press conference yesterday that cooperation with international partners is, quote, based on compromise. He said, as the president of an independent state, I will not allow anybody to dictate something to us. All this is a matter of compromise. So if the president compromises, is the IMF ready to compromise? Is there a basis for compromise on such a key issue as the anti-corruption court?
What we are ultimately interested in is putting in place a foundation for a strong economy that's going to be growing for a long time and generating increasing incomes, low unemployment, stable environment, so moving away from the boom and bust cycles that Ukraine's seen since independence. And for this to happen, there are some key reforms that need to be implemented, one of them being the establishment of an anti-corruption court. Corruption is a major problem for Ukraine's economic development. As Marie said here earlier, it's holding back investment and is also, it's a matter of fairness to the Ukrainian population. Our assessment is that without an effective anti-corruption court, it's going to be difficult for Ukraine to attract the type of investment that's needed in order to generate long-term growth. So I think we are looking forward to seeing a strong anti-corruption court and a court that is able to adjudicate in high corruption cases.
How confident are you, though, that there is a bill on the anti-corruption court is going to the Rada today for a first reading, I understand, but the bill in its current form doesn't comply with what the IMF and the Venice Commission have asked for, particularly on issues to do with independence, guaranteeing independence of judges. How confident are you that during its passage through the Rada, it will be possible to make the amendments required to get it into compliance with what the IMF has asked for?
That is correct, that we want to see the proposed legislation being strengthened in a few areas. You're right, it's been now, it's going up for a first reading in Parliament, and after that opening up for the possibility to introduce those amendments. We hope that is going to happen, and that we will see a strong legislation opening up for the establishment of this court later on in this year.
Okay, perhaps could I ask Francis Malige to come in on this point, because I think you have thoughts as well on the anti-corruption court and its importance. Obviously, is the EBRD. And I'll come to you in a moment. Okay. We have lots of people who want to talk on this issue. Let me go to Francis first, and then we'll go to Katarina. So on the ACC, how important is this for you as well, the EBRD, in terms of the work that you're doing in Ukraine?
Well, it is. It's essential. It is vital for Ukraine's economy because we heard the head of NABU clearly a few minutes ago, and essentially his message was the clock's ticking, because if I don't get results for my team will be demotivated, and getting results for his team means that the work that his detectives do is actually recognized somewhere in a court of law that gives it a fair and decent hearing. And why is it important for us? It's because if we don't have if we cannot say to investors who we are trying to attract into Ukraine, you come build a plant, produce here, and your plant is not going to be stolen from you, then it's hard to attract them. Now, and of course, you reduce the risk greatly by investing with an institution like Jason's or the EBRD, the IFC or the EBRD, provide a degree of protection, but that's not the way it should be. It should be for the courts to provide a degree of protection. And that's why in the last years of the Yanukovych regime, it was very hard to work even with the private sector, let alone with the public sector. And that's why we, with the support of donors like the EU and the US and other countries, we created a business ombudsman institution. The business ombudsman is in this room. And I would encourage businesses to go to him when they have issues. But that, and it was the first anti-corruption institution that operated after Maidan. Just 1 year after signing the agreement with the government, we had it up and running. But that is, again, very helpful, but not enough. And so corruption eats away at the fabric of the country. It represents massive amounts of money. I think you have to give due where it is. This government and its predecessor have done a lot to reduce the flows of corrupt money. Okay, so corruption is opportunities for corruption and is punishment for the corrupt people, right? On the first, there's been tremendous progress. There's remaining issues around, I would say for me, the large remaining issues around corruption are still some in the gas sector, state-owned enterprises, state-owned land, Okay? People say, oh, when we lose the transit contract with Gazprom, we're going to lose potentially 2 billion of revenue. If the state got proper commercial rent for its state-owned land, it would get 1 billion. Not 2, but 1. Okay? I don't know what's the number. I'd like to see a statistic. How much does the government of Ukraine and various institutions that are involved in operating the state-owned land get as a proper commercial rent for their land? That's 10 million hectares. We're not talking about a small amount. We're not talking about a small size. Okay? And by the way, there's absolutely no political cost in privatizing state-owned land. There's a political cost in disrupting some very cozy arrangements with some powerful people, yes. But the little farmers will not see their operations disrupted, will not see their land being taken away by corrupt people. There is no fear to be had. There's only benefits to be had about privatizing state-owned land. So I would actually say, as we go into this last year before the election, you don't need to be a kamikaze government to do this. You just need to have the political will. That's just examples, but the establishment of an anti-corruption court is a critical part of building a lasting new Ukraine. Because
Understood.
This conference is about step by step, and I agree it's a great message, as long as the steps are all in the right direction.
And they're big steps. Katarina Mathernova, you also wanted to come in on this issue, I think.
Briefly, first of all, I think it's important to say that also for the European Union, the anti-corruption court is a must, and this is a message that would be useful for our Ukrainian friends to understand that this is where the international community stands together. I just want to, and it's increasingly difficult to say anything that hasn't been said, and I was just going to make a similar point to what Francis just did, but I think it's important in a room where hopefully there are some investors to say, the finance minister started by saying investment is investing in a story. And there is a very corrosive story about Ukraine, certainly in Europe. It's so corrupt, it's practically a failed state. And I cannot disagree with it more. It's the Russian narrative that has been very successfully peddled, both here but very successfully abroad. And I just want to say there has been a lot that's been done on eliminating corruption, even from the arbitrage on the fixed exchange rate and by letting hryvnia float, or whether it's cleaning up the banking sector. You mentioned closing the spigot for the gas barons, etc., or the VAT refunds. You name it, a lot of it. Privatization remains, and state-owned enterprises, a big concentrated last pocket of corruption, apart from the judicial system. So it's true that it holds back investment. It's not appreciated by the population. But the narrative is not what the underlying truth is, and a lot has been done, and I think this is very important to say.
That's a very good point, and one worth emphasizing. There's been huge progress made. This is not in any sense a failed state. It is about, though, moving to the next stage. I want to move on to talking about the investment and the business climate later on, time permitting. Let me just come back, though, to Gosta Ljungman, if I may, of the IMF. In your assessment, how long can Ukraine actually do without the next tranche? And the US ambassador hinted at the possibility Ukraine might try and go it alone without the IMF. In your view, is there any possibility that it could actually do that?
I don't know. I think it's a much more productive discussion is to focus on what's necessary to do in order to unlock the next tranche. And I think if we see the next program review being completed and being completed through through making advances on key structural reforms and on ensuring that macroeconomic policy continues to be strong, then we don't see any issues in Ukraine servicing its external debt.
Okay, let's move on to look at the potential for growth and investment. What is your assessment at the IMF of Ukraine's potential economic growth? Because growth last year was only a shade over 2%, 2.1%, I think, which was disappointing. The finance minister said this morning Ukraine should be growing much faster than that, catching up with the rest of the continent, bouncing back after the big contraction in 2015, 2016. What's your assessment of the potential and growth and how to get there?
I couldn't agree more that really backing up, first of all, let's recognize that Ukraine went through a very serious crisis in 2014 and 15, losing close to 20% of its output. At the same time, we see countries in neighboring, the neighbors of Ukraine growing at 3%, 4%, 5%. So the gap between Ukraine and the countries that it should be catching up with has widened, not narrowed. Now it's good to see see growth returning. So it's good to see growth last year 2%. Perhaps this year we'll get 3.5%. But it's far from enough. Ukraine needs to grow at a substantially higher rate in order to catch up with other countries, and also in order to really improve living standards in Ukraine, which is that's the central objective of this. What's needed is to get higher levels of investment. So investment to GDP now in Ukraine is what, 17, 18%. Probably should be more in the more something like 25, 30%. I don't want to, because I don't know what really in a country like Ukraine, where there's a ban on the sale of agricultural land, where we see extremely high levels of corruption, is very different and a very large and largely unreformed state-owned enterprise sector. It's difficult to say what potential growth is, but I mean clearly growth could easily be much higher. Double, triple what it is now, with the right reforms and the continuation of strong policies.
So you would see something like even 6-8%, which gets talked about as being potentially the kind of figure that Ukraine could be looking for if it got the conditions in place.
Given where Ukraine is now, that does not seem unreasonable.
Okay. Let me move down the panel again. Katarina Mathernova, perhaps. In terms of financing and investment, there's been renewed talk recently from places like Lithuania, for example, on the need for a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. We heard this a few years ago. There wasn't really anything that quite amounts to a Marshall Plan. This talk has come back. Do you think that kind of talk is useful? Is there any possibility of it? And is in Ukraine in the kind of state now where it could absorb that kind of Marshall Plan and really make use of it?
Thank you very much. Getting to the Marshall Plan, just one comment. When I hear that there is disappointing growth of 2% in Ukraine, and yes, it can be more. Let's remember 2 years ago they were on a financial meltdown path. Yeah. So I actually think that from a European perspective, the turnaround over the last 2 years is remarkable. And to even go to growth from 2 or 2.5 years ago, really being on the brink of bankruptcy, is remarkable. And I think we need to remember that. Well, my first reaction on the Marshall Plan is that we like the idea. The first thing we did is rebrand it into European Plan for Ukraine in discussion with our Lithuanian friends. And I think it's been an extremely useful initiative in raising awareness of the need for investment, and related to that, for the investment-friendly reforms that need to take place, and the need to build administrative and implementation capacity So we are in a lot of discussions with our Lithuanian friends how to co-brand it and put it together with something I'm going to talk about in the afternoon in one of the panels or separate sessions on what we just launched in the European Union, the external investment plan, which is putting into our toolbox something we didn't have so far, which is a massive de-risking facility to crowd in the private sector. And we work with our IFI partners, EBRD. Actually, France's team is the most active and put 7 out of the 30 proposals that we received, and they are evaluating now. And a lot of them cover Ukraine. So there is very much a recognition of the need for investment. And so we are now putting new money on the table through this de-risking facility. But one of the things that we clearly identified as one of the first priorities is for this country to strengthen the capacity to actually use what's being committed and is not disbursing even from the official lenders. There's over 5 billion euros in the accounts of EIB, the World Bank, EBRD, that are sitting there waiting to be invested in the economy. So for that you need communication capacity, and that's something that we are trying to focus on when we talk about the European investment plan for Ukraine also.
But there is, as I understand it, that Ukraine has requested a new macro-financial assistance program from the EU, and there is discussion on this going on at the moment. Can you update us on where things are at with that?
Well, we cleared the first hurdle, which was sort of a positive assessment by the collective body, which is the College of Commissioners, to prepare a Commission proposal, which should happen in the first part of March. And so I'm not going to be able to talk about details because that's going to only come together in a few weeks. But we are talking about 1 billion euros. The Commission proposal is only the first step. We have co-legislators, which is the Member States and the European Parliament, that have a big say in this. So in terms of the actual conditionality, that's going to be a process that we'll have to go through both in Brussels as well as with our Ukrainian partners. But one thing that is very clear is that for our macro-financial assistance to come on stream, we need either a letter from the IMF or an IMF program.
Right.
And so whatever the Ukrainian government is committed to deliver for the next tranche of the IMF program is very relevant for us as well.
Of course. Let me bring in Jason Pellmar on the end there to talk about the International Finance Corporation's role here in investments in Ukraine. You manage a very large portfolio, so tell us about the IFC's role here.
Thank you, Neil. Maybe just to pick up on words which I particularly liked from the U.S. ambassador on the role of EBRD and IFC blazing a trail. And indeed, our institutions are structured such that we need to create opportunities together with the government and the private sector in mobilizing investment into key areas like agriculture, like infrastructure. And on the infrastructure theme, it's a point in time now when the trail needs to become a highway. And I mean that in a literal sense. $2 billion of FDI this past calendar year has already been discussed at length, and for a country the size of Ukraine and the potential is really unacceptable. And I think so. The role of IFC in promoting private sector investment, together with our partners, we very much do support the IMF program. We think it's necessary. The reforms that are effort that's being led by the World Bank and EBRD and IMF will hopefully create the conditions that will give some of you in this room comfort that you should be deploying capital. I think we heard very good messages from some of the reformers in government on the earlier panel. And indeed, if some of those reforms really start to advance at a pace that I think all of us would like to see, then there's no reason why we can't see 6% GDP growth in Ukraine in the near future. How do we get there? So agriculture has historically been the growth engine of the Ukrainian economy, and a good portfolio, a good quantum of the IFC portfolio has indeed been in agriculture. But there is lots of opportunity. We've heard the themes of IT and innovation, and that needs to percolate into other sectors of the economy. Infrastructure at large. The method of, the message of decentralization, helping municipalities in supporting their urban infrastructure needs. The privatization and reform of state-owned enterprises. IFC is currently engaged with the fourth largest bank in Ukraine, Ukrgazbank, where we've taken the lead on helping them, starting with a trade facility, but now building on that and building out green finance, energy finance, which is now 10% of the bank's portfolio, but now talking about pre-privatization. This would be the first real privatization in Ukraine for the past many years. And that would send, hopefully, the right signal, again, to investors in this room that Ukraine is indeed open for business and serious about reform. PPPs is another avenue where I think we can bring in real capital into the Ukrainian economy. And this is another great example of cooperation together with Francis, EBRD, where we are working on two port concessions in the south, Olvia and Kherson, which, when structured properly, will bring in private sector investment into critical parts of the infrastructure in Ukraine. So I think that there's no shortage of need, but we're going to need the support of the government and the support of the private sector in bringing this to fruition.
I'd like to ask you, Jason, and also then come on to Francis with us the same question. You both work with private investors. Now, there's been a lot of talk, of course, about tackling corruption, about strengthening rule of law, as being key steps needed to encourage more private investment. What else is needed? Are there other things that Ukraine could and should be doing to improve the climate for business and investment and make sure that it really can bring in the private investment that it needs?
So, absolutely. And IFC has been playing a role in that. We have an investment climate program. One area where IFC has already had success is lowering port tariffs, for example, by 20% to help agri-export. Helping Ukrainian agri-companies export to EU, and now in some cases even to China. So these are areas where more can be done in the banking sector, working together with my World Bank colleagues on NPL sector reform, where Ukraine has the highest NPLs globally. So there's no shortage of areas where more can be done in multiple sectors across the economy.
Thank you. Francis, let me bring you in on that same question. What still needs to be done on improving the business and investment environment? And also, Jason mentioned the banking sector. I think, the EBRD has talked about investing in Ukrainian state-owned banks. We heard from the finance minister about, I think this morning, about the target to reduce the share of state ownership in the banking sector. So is that something that you're going to be getting involved in?
Yes, well, we are involved.
Yep.
I'd just like to say on the banking sector, there's a new state-owned bank strategy that's just been presented by the minister. I think it's a great step forward. The next steps include improving the corporate governance of state-owned banks. We have all together, has been a remarkable cooperation among IFIs, been able to implement a good governance structure in private bank following its nationalization, and that was the condition for me to go on that board, and which I then did. We are actually also looking at investing in Oshad Bank in a pre-privatization. I won't take from Jason the fact that he's going to be the first, because Oshad is going to take longer than Ukrogas Bank. I would though claim that it's larger. Therefore, we all have a claim to something. But jokes aside, I think the banking sector is a place where, of course, more is needed. And it's not just about corruption. I'd like to say, though, I mean, we all complain a lot about corruption, and rightly so. But Ukraine is a country where you can do business without paying bribes. And time and again, our clients come to us and they say, we work with you, we work alone, but we do not pay bribes, and it might take a little bit longer to achieve a certain number of things, to get your licenses, to get your permits. Occasionally, you need to send someone higher up in power to make sure that these licenses are actually looked at fairly, and so on and so forth. But it is possible. It is possible for investors to come into Ukraine today and to work without corruption. Now, there's a number of things that are already on the books and need to be implemented. For example, the energy sector law. The moment you actually implement what's on the books when it comes to upstream investment, when it comes to demonopolization of not just of Naftogaz. Everyone says Naftogaz is a monopoly, and that is true. But there's also other monopolies in the gas sector, for example, in the distribution of gas.
Yeah.
The market shares of people do not show it because someone has 50% and someone has 20% and so on. That's not correct. When they have 50%, it means they have a monopoly on half of the country. That's different from competition, all right? And so that's, if we see demonopolization of the entire gas sector, that's extremely high, important investment opportunities for the private sector.
Okay, Francis.
Sorry, and just to say another example.
Very quick point, because I'm getting signals we have to wrap up.
Very, very quickly,
Yep.
but just to build on the example that Jason was talking about in concessions. We've worked on the concession law. When we have concessions, it's not just these two ports that could be open for competition. It could be airports, it could be other ports, it could be even roads, why not? And that also is going to not just bring in private sector investment into Ukraine, but the moment you have a well-functioning infrastructure, you see more investment. I was just in Mariupol this week. It's a nightmare to get there. You have to fly to Zaporizhia, and then you have to take 4 hours on a bad road. In a good day, it took us 4 hours to go, and because of the snow, it took us 7 to come back. That's just to Zaporizhia. Right? The moment you do actually have a proper road leading there and the proper airport there, you'll see more investment.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. We do have to wrap up. Literally 30 seconds, because I've got to finish. Yeah.
3 points. What Uke Mingarelli said, the biggest asset are people. And second, it was impressive to see a lineup of so many reform ministers. When we were doing transition reforms in our countries, I'm from Slovakia, the former Minister of Finance sits in the second row. We didn't have this number of reform-minded ministers, so I think that's really important to remember. And the third point is, as Hugues said also, it would be extremely unfortunate to have early elections in this country, because now we have the possibility to really go and help implement what has been impressively legislated, etc., and to get into a pre-election cycle would really cut that window opportunity short.
Understood. We'll get onto that in the political panel. Thank you very much to our panelists. I apologise for having to cut you off. We have the Prime Minister waiting to speak, so could please people remain seated in the hall so that we can hand over very quickly to Mr. Groysman, the Prime Minister. But thanks again to all panelists.